Hi, I'm Rhys Coleman, Waterways and Wetlands Research Manager in the Applied Research team at Melbourne Water. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Melbourne Streams, where we're showcasing research coming out of the Waterways and Wetlands Research Program. In this first series, we're releasing a talk a day based on topics voted on by the Waterways and Land crews. Today's talk is from Dr. Kathy Russell of the Melbourne Waterway Research to Practice Partnership with the University of Melbourne. This is a second talk from Kathy in this series. Kathy is a fluvial geomorphologist working on the impacts of urbanisation on stream physical form and function. Her research interests include sediment supply and transport in urban streams, sediment pollution produced from construction areas, prediction of stream channel adjustment to urban conditions, and opportunities for physical form management in urban areas by promoting natural stream adjustment or interactions with floodplains. Today, Kathy's talk is about sediment pollution from urban construction areas. She'll cover an international literature review that she did that helps us think about how important might construction activities with urban development be in terms of water quality compared to, say, a mature urban area. Kathy's also done a desktop analysis looking at sites across Melbourne and thinking about the various construction phases and the relative risks in terms of sediment supply to streams. She'll provide international examples also about efforts for sediment control on construction sites and the challenges that they've been facing and the potential ways forward for improving sediment control. Kathy finishes with some Melbourne Water context and some ideas for Melbourne Water to be thinking about in terms of potential risks from urban construction. This is part of a broader project with the Melbourne Waterway Research to Practice Partnership. So the desktop work that Kathy did is the first phase. We're now moving into collecting data at some sites in the southeast of Melbourne so we can validate some of these findings that we've got from the desktop study. If you have any technical questions about Kathy's talk, then please contact Kathy directly. She's provided her contact details in the presentation. Or if you have broader questions about the Waterways and Wetlands Research Program, including the Melbourne Waterway Research to Practice Partnership, then feel free to contact myself or Slobodanka Stojkovic, who's also in the Waterways and Wetlands Research Program. Of course, you can also visit Research Hub on the intranet and search the various research projects we've been delivering over the past 10 years or so and get access to project summaries, reports, papers, presentations, and other outputs from those various projects. I really hope you enjoy Kathy's second talk, and we look forward to providing you more talks in the days to come. Thanks.
Hello and welcome to this training video on sediment pollution from urban construction sites. My name is Kathy Russell. I'm a research fellow at the Waterway Ecosystem Research Group at the University of Melbourne. So today this video is going to be structured as a series of questions about sediment pollution from urban construction. Firstly, how important is sediment from urban construction in the scheme of things? Which are the highest impact construction phases and activities? What's going wrong with erosion and sediment control on construction sites? And what can Melbourne Water staff do about it? And so this is based mainly on some desktop work that I've been doing as part of one of the projects that we're running in partnership with Melbourne Water on construction sediment yields in Western Port Bay. But over the last few months, I've been doing some desktop analysis looking at recorded residential construction data from the state government, looking at earthworks extents and volumes from LiDAR digital elevation models, and looking at near-map imagery of greenfield construction areas and growth areas. I've made some field observations, but nothing systematic as yet. So monitoring is in progress and is being set up at the moment. We're hoping for some more quantitative data in future. And some of the insights that I'll present are from literature from mainly from the United States and Europe. So our first question, how important is sediment from construction in the scheme of things? So from the work that's been done before in the literature, we know already that construction strongly influences sediment supply. So when a catchment transitions usually from agricultural land use through to urban land use, we know that there is an intense spike in the sediment export from that land during the construction phase. And so this was first outlined in 1967 by Wellman, which is this conceptual model on the left. And then a few years ago, I looked at the global literature and aggregated all of the data that had been collected on this topic and validated that model, and found that the data supported that there was this huge spike where sediment yields increased by about an order of magnitude compared to what they were under agriculture. We see sediment impacts from construction everywhere, in sedimentation in streams, channels, estuaries, lakes. We also see the impacts on water quality, increasing turbidity in our streams. And so in the Melbourne context, we want to know how prevalent is construction in Melbourne and where is it occurring? So where we might prioritise our actions to try to address that. So the method that I used to do this was taking state government GIS data, which showed the lots, the cadastral lots that had construction on them from 2005 to 2016. And then I used the difference between two LiDAR digital elevation models, 10 years apart, to show the changes in land elevation, which indicated earthworks. And then, so I took the fraction of land with recorded construction and the fraction of land with major earthworks, and that's more than 0.3 metres elevation change, and analyse that against the distance from the city centre and the age of development. And so when you look at these LiDAR data sets, you see a really clear signature of residential construction. So on the right, you can see that's the difference in elevation between the 2018 land surface and the 2008 land surface. So you see very clear elevation differences, mainly fill in the new residential lots. You see a mix of cut and fill in the roads, and you see cut where there's new waterways or wetlands or waterway enlargement. And statistically, we see a clear difference between the proportion of the land that has major earthworks or major changes in elevation between the areas with recorded construction and the areas without recorded construction. So where we have recorded construction in the GIS database, we have somewhere between 0.15 and or 15% and 50% of that land having major changes in elevation in the LiDAR data, whereas for other areas we only have about 10%. So that gives us really good support that LiDAR is a good tool for detecting earthworks and residential construction. So some results from that study. Firstly, the recorded residential construction area from the state government data. I found that the outer growth local government areas, 6 of them, had about 20% of their area under construction over that 11-year period. And they had, on average, around 3 times as much of their area under construction as a percentage than the other urban local government areas. And those growth LGAs represent a significant proportion of the total city area, about 40%. And so altogether, they represent 2/3 of the total construction area across the Melbourne urban growth boundary. Then if we look at the major earthworks, which is indicated by the change in elevation over that 10-year period, those growth local government areas had 12% of their area having major earthworks with more than 0.3 metres of change over that period. Similarly, half of the city's total major earthworks area was in those 6 growth LGAs. And of that, 2/3 of that was in residential construction areas. So, urban construction in Melbourne is pretty important. It's particularly important in Melbourne's growth areas. So these 6 LGAs on the outskirts of Melbourne, which account for half of Melbourne's major earthworks and 2/3 of Melbourne's residential construction area. It's particularly important in residential developments. So these residential developments account for about half of Melbourne's total major earthworks extent, and 2/3 of the major earthworks extent in growth areas. I just wanted to note there's still a lot of Melbourne's urban growth boundary yet to be developed. On the right, the grey there is the current urban extent, and the black line is the urban growth boundary. So it's really worth improving construction and sediment management to protect those areas that are going to be urbanised over the next 10, 20, 30 years. I'd also like to note that site-specific factors that affect the erosion potential of the soil, things like slope and soil type, as well as climate or rainfall, will influence which areas around the outskirts of Melbourne will have highest risk. And so this assessment that I've done just looks at the relative changes in elevation and earthworks, but not those site-specific factors. So, second question was, which are the highest impact construction phases and activities? So firstly, and so this is important to be able to prioritise which of those activities on a building site we want to regulate most closely, or which we should prioritise for tighter controls. So firstly, I'll present some findings from the literature. From the United States, North Carolina, there's been 2 studies done there, and Finland. So in North Carolina, these 2 studies both found that the early phases of construction, so these would be the clearing and bulk earthworks phases, had much higher sediment concentrations and loads than the later construction phases, than the house construction and landscaping. In Finland, on the other hand, the highest concentrations and loads were associated with the later construction phases, with the building construction and paving works, and not so much with the road and sewer construction or bulk earthworks phases. So we're not seeing in the literature a consistent understanding or consistent results around which phases are most important. And we're also not seeing a consistent conceptual model of how to group or classify these construction phases in a way that is relevant to the hydrology and the sediment supply potential of the site. So I wanted to improve those conceptual models using some data from construction sites around Melbourne to investigate the temporal pattern of how construction proceeds in those sites and how that construction process is relevant to runoff generation and sediment export potential. So I chose 6 construction sites, one in each of those outer growth LGAs. Each of them were about 10 hectares with 130 to 200 lots. And each of those was randomly sampled from all the available construction sites in those LGAs. And so for each of those sites, I collated all of the available high temporal resolution aerial imagery from Nearmap. And so that was at about 2-month spacing, so I could get a really good picture of how those sites were changing on a fine time scale. And so this is an example of what that data looked like, both on the site scale on the left-hand side, or on the development scale, and on the lot scale. And so throughout this series of aerial photos, I measured changes in bare soil cover, impervious cover, number of houses completed, and number of houses with landscaping completed over the construction period. And this was over a period of about 4 to 9 years in the different sites. And then from that, I developed a conceptual model of hydrologically and sedimentologically relevant construction phases and their potential runoff and sediment supply. So here are the results of that land cover assessment. I found that the 6 sites followed relatively consistent land disturbance patterns. So at the top there is the proportion of bare soil cover over time in years. And so you can see that every one of the sites reached almost 100% bare soil cover during their bulk earthworks phase. The lowest was about 80%. And then that bare soil cover started to taper off as roads were built and then as houses were built. They also, they varied, but they almost all had some period of soil disturbance prior to the main earthworks stage. And so these are site preparation activities like stockpiling or heavy vehicle traffic for vehicles accessing neighbouring sites, or soil stockpiling activities supporting neighbouring sites. And so there was, on average, around 1 to 3 years of pre-bulk earthwork site disturbance. The roads and drains were constructed at the same time. As the roads were sealed, they were connected to drainage, and so as that happened, you can see at the bottom the proportion of impervious cover started to increase rapidly and then continued to increase as houses were completed. And then following houses being completed, lagging around a year later, they were stabilised and landscaped to their final lot configuration and land cover. So usually these houses are handed over without landscaping in their yards, and so they'd be handed over and then the new owners would undertake landscaping, which then involves another round of soil disturbance. So I aggregated all of those sites into an average curve of the bare soil cover and impervious cover, as you can see at the top there. Then I estimated potential runoff, which was based on published runoff coefficients for vegetated land, bare soil, which was estimated to be about double that from vegetated land, and from impervious surfaces. And so I calculated that runoff coefficient, and then I calculated a relative indicator of potential sediment supply, which was based on the runoff coefficient as well as the bare soil cover. So the bare soil cover indicates how much sediment is available to be transported, and the runoff coefficient indicates how much water is available to transport that sediment and export it from site. And so then that gave the second panel of that figure a peak of potential sediment supply during bulk earthworks, which then starts to decline but stays relatively high as the roads and drains are constructed, and then declines through house construction and landscaping. And so I split this into those categories, or those phases of construction, based on hydrologic changes in land cover. So the site preparation works were before major stripping of soil and before major earthworks. And then the bulk earthworks are characterised by this huge increase in soil disturbance, approaching 100% bare soil cover. Then road and drain construction is associated with increased runoff due to increased imperviousness in connection to drainage. House construction is associated with additional impervious cover, additional runoff, but declining bare soil cover. And then landscaping is that residual, some further disturbance of soil, but declining bare soil cover over time. And then finally it gets to this stable-ish mature urban phase where soil disturbance stabilises at low levels. Now, so the brown curve there is the relative potential sediment supply rate. So at a point in time, what's the relative rate of sediment supply? And the area under that curve is the potential sediment load. So over a period of time, how much sediment in tonnes is going to be delivered to the stream. And so that load it's quite significant in all the phases, because while that bulk earthworks phase is intense, it's quite short-lived. And while that site preparation phase, for example, is not so intense, it's quite long-lived, and so it can supply quite a significant sediment load. But that sediment load was highest in the road and drain construction and the house construction phases. And so these represent both development scale activities that are done by the developer in the road and drain construction, and lot scale activities that are done by house builders. Any of those phases' sediment loads can be greatly increased if the duration of intensive sediment supply activities like earthworks is extended. And we saw that in one of the sites that I analysed that had a very much extended bulk earthworks phase. And so that site is likely to produce significantly more sediment over its life than the other sites. And that sediment is likely to be mostly supplied by the bulk earthworks phase. Again, this model didn't include site-specific effects of soil type, slope, or climate, but it's intended to only assess relative changes over time at a site. So which of these phases is relatively higher than the others? It doesn't include the effects of stormwater treatment or sediment control. So it represents the potential sediment supply without management, which can be useful for us to prioritise those management actions without being prejudiced by what's in place now. So in conclusion for this question, the highest potential sediment supply rate from construction comes from the phases of bulk earthworks, followed by road and drain construction. But the highest potential sediment load comes from the road and drain construction, followed by house construction phases. Those potential loads are sensitive to the duration of soil disturbance. And so this indicates that sediment control is important on both development scale and lot scale activities, and that limiting the duration of soil exposure, either by staging measures that only expose a small portion of the land at one time, or by reseeding and mulching areas that are exposed as soon as possible, those kind of measures should be a priority. Now, just a little bit of doom and gloom. There have been many studies, mainly in the United States, that have found significant failings with erosion and sediment control. I haven't seen any studies that do a similar thing in Australia, so my insights about Australia are based on my field observations and my talking to people in councils and people that make observations of these sites. But these US studies that did this in a more systematic way, one of them found this science policy gap where the best available science wasn't being implemented in the policy or the regulatory framework. And so Kaufman found that there was generally poor implementation of measures. So measures would be designed more as a box-checking exercise rather than with a genuine intent to reduce sediment loads. And this is partly because there was a lack of basic site data about the soils and the topography, and so these measures weren't being designed smartly for the site to be as efficient as possible. He also found that there were broadly problems with institutional frameworks which created disincentives to follow those best management practice recommendations. So Kaufman and another study have both found poor performance on many specific erosion and sediment control measures. Kaufman found that soil stabilisation measures like mulching and seeding, as well as staging measures, were almost always poorly implemented. And he found that filter fences and sediment basins were usually poorly implemented. Hayes found that lot scale measures, so measures for house construction, were particularly poorly implemented. He found that people weren't protecting drain inlets from ingress of sediments, and he found that maintenance was poor on pretty much all the measures, that they may be being implemented, but they weren't being maintained. Another study looked at the enforcement style of erosion and sediment control. And so Rees and Carmen found that the laws as they're written are not particularly important. What matters is the frequency of inspection. So they compared 3 different jurisdictions, and the one that inspected their building sites weekly got much better outcomes than the others. They commented that fines are particularly ineffective as an enforcement tool, but they're generally seen by developers as a cost of doing business. And they recommended that stop work orders would be much more effective than fines. And they also recommended this education approach by regulators and a cooperative, flexible approach that would enable and empower developers to develop novel and site-appropriate design solutions rather than just fitting in with a rigid design guideline. So yeah, as I mentioned, the Melbourne context is mainly based on anecdotal evidence and my own site observations, but I see many of the same issues here as in the United States. I think that people working in the regulation space here are doing the best they can, but they do struggle to overcome resource limitations. And I think that developers, particularly the larger and reputable developers, some of them are putting in place good practice, but there are many that are not, and particularly on lot scale activities, there aren't really incentives to control erosion and sediment supply, and it's particularly difficult for councils to regulate those lot scale activities when you have hundreds of builders doing activities in a development. And so I see many examples of poorly implemented and maintained sediment control measures. And if you visit any construction sites around Melbourne, you'll probably see the same. Things like sediment fences that are either overwhelmed with sediment or not placed properly, so they're being bypassed. Sediment basins being pumped out directly into the stream when they're still turbid, and particularly prevalent, we see stockpiling of dirt and gravel and other materials on nature strips and even in gutters where it can wash directly into streams, and we rarely see any protection of those drainage inlets. Now, there are potential improvements coming to Victoria's regulatory framework with our new environmental laws. So there's a new amendment has been put in place to Victoria's Environment Protection Act, which is intended to come into effect in July 2021. And that contains this General Environmental Duty, or GED. And so this requires all Victorians to manage risks to human health and to the environment that their activities create. And so there's no requirement for actual harm to occur for that regulation to be in place. It's just about understanding risks and managing those risks appropriately. And so that could greatly improve the regulation of diffuse pollution sources, including construction sediment. Under that, the controls that are put in place must be in line with the state of knowledge within the industry. And so that's industry understanding of the science and guidelines. And so as part of the implementation of this GED, EPA will need to focus on working with industry, coordinating with other regulators, and educating the community to improve that state of knowledge so that developers and other potential polluters have that knowledge in order to manage their risks appropriately. And then they'll also be able to have stronger sanctions available to implement for people who are not implementing risk controls that are in line with that state of knowledge. So the final question, and just to wrap up, what can Melbourne Water staff do? It can be a bit overwhelming, and I know this driving around the suburbs of Melbourne and seeing so much poor practice. And it really depends on your role and how much contact you have with these kind of sites and with decision makers who manage them. But if you do have an opportunity, I'd encourage you to take opportunities to advocate for better sediment control, either on site, with people working on site, or with decision makers. If you do work a lot around these sites, then you can get to know the key responsible people and start to open up conversations about good and bad practice and compliance issues. So generally in residential construction, council are the main responsible authorities for inspection and regulation. Melbourne Water are responsible for inspection and regulation on construction of waterway assets. Vic Roads are the relevant authority for road construction, and EPA may be relevant for complex sites or high-risk sites. You can report breaches where you see them to those regulatory authorities. And I would encourage you to stay informed about the implementation of the GED and the changes to Victoria's regulatory framework over the next couple of years. So thank you for listening. I hope you found that useful, and I'm happy for anyone to email me for any further information, questions, or if you want to get details of any of the papers that I referenced in this presentation. Thank you.